George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American, died after being handcuffed and pinned to the ground with a police officer's knee to his neck. He said many times that he couldn't breathe, but was ignored. And the incident has sparked protests and outrage across the United States. It all began with Floyd being reported for allegedly trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill. So why does police brutality and racial bias keep showing up in the U.S.? How have African Americans and other minorities suffered from injustice and inequality? And with the added impact of COVID-19, what is the human rights situation in America? To talk about these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined by Brandon Andrews, an entrepreneur and former Capitol Hill staffer, and U.S. political commentator Laura Schwartz, and Huo Zhenjing, professor of law at China University of Political Science and Law. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhu Yuan. So this black man, George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American, he died in Minneapolis on May the 25th after being handcuffed and pinned to the ground by a white police officer putting a knee to his neck. So, Brendan, first of all, how did you feel when you saw and heard the news? And what do you think the response have been?
Well, I'm sad at the loss of life here. I'm sad as a black man in America to have this conversation again. We've certainly made significant progress since African Americans were enslaved in this country, despite being enslaved, despite racism, despite systemic oppression. African Americans have made significant contributions to the country, but yet we're here again with George Floyd. I think the primary thrust going forward has to be fixing the justice system, but also pushing every American to make sure that as they are engaging with others, that they engage in a way that's driven by love, and that they treat people the way that they should be treated. I think the broader conversation here is, you mentioned George Floyd was arrested for using a counterfeit $20 bill. You have to ask the question why he was arrested for using that $20 bill. Similarly, Eric Garner, who also yelled out, "I can't breathe," before being killed in New York City, was selling loose cigarettes. And so there's an economic issue here that causes African Americans to constantly put themselves in risky positions to provide for themselves and provide for their families. And yes, we need to fix the justice system, but we have to get economic justice as well, I think, to prevent these things from happening in the future.
And Laura, what about your take? Do Americans think of this problem the same, or some people have different ideas what happened?
I do believe that even with all the heartbreak and anger we've seen over this last week and months and years as we seem to deal with this issue over and over again, do realize that human rights are not exclusive to any one color or any one socioeconomic status. And what we saw last week was another symptom and reaction to that economic, that health care, and that justice disparity that too often rears its head. So what I look to are those making meaningful change. I look to and find optimism in the protests during the daylight before the riots over the color of night. I think that there are things that the administration can do and lead from in a forward motion. But I think there are also things we can do every day, not just as citizens of the United States, but global citizens of the world, to respect and honor those of all colors and all stations in life. And that's something I hope that we learn through this experience.
And the death of Floyd has sparked protests across the United States. Fires burning, tear gas canisters flying, police precinct burned in Minneapolis. CNN headquarters was vandalized, and protesters clashed with police outside the White House. Did you see this coming? Do people around you expect this? Laura?
No, to be honest, no. We saw protests that were peaceful and policy driven with the horrible murder of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. And as we moved through this last week, as I walked through my city of Chicago yesterday, just blocks away, to see 8 bullet holes in a store window, to see graffiti tagged on historic buildings and epithets slurred throughout the city, and cars that were burnt out and buildings that were burnt, you can't help but become emotional. You can't help but ask yourself, how can I be part of the change? Whether that's picking up a garbage bag and starting to clean up, as so many Minnesotans have done day after the nights of riots, to going to your city council meetings, to going to vote this November on the change and policy you see needed. I've been incredibly alarmed that we are finding out that our Justice Department on a federal level has not followed through with the initiatives and the guidelines that were put in place by the Obama administration after the riots in Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown and Eric Garner for 21st century policing. I think it goes way beyond policing, but that is an area we need to get back to. You can't just think this is going to go away after a year of reform or some nice documents, or it's going to take a real concerted and consistent effort on behalf of all, especially our lawmakers and leaders in the position of that change, and all of us that can be a part of it as well.
Brendan, how would you describe the protesters' acts, obviously turning violent on the streets?
Well, I live in Washington, D.C., and on Saturday, Black Lives Matter Washington, D.C. had a car protest, and I was encouraged to see the protest. I was there myself and participated during the day, and was encouraged to see the diversity of the participants. They were white, they were black, they were Asian American, they were Latinx, they were old, and they were young, and they were all protesting again police brutality, but also, to Laura's point, talking about some significant policy and other changes that are necessary for progress here. I think that the rioting can often damage communities, and we have to be very careful about making sure that when we stir people up, that we give them a channel, that we give them a way to express the feelings, to express the emotion. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of these riots. We're seeing a combination of people feeling like the system doesn't work, that they've tried doing it the right way, and so why continue trying to do it the right way when we're not getting results? Although I do think some results have come from especially the movement over the past decade, and certainly the movement over the past few generations. But I do think police in a lot of places were surprised by the amount of attention and by the groundswell of support that this movement has gotten so quickly. But it really has been a culmination of things. So the first thing is, African Americans have been significantly and severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which I know we'll discuss. On top of that, you have these 3 publicly seen murders over the past few months in the United States, and add on top of that, black businesses were largely shut out of the Paycheck Protection Program that the government passed to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, and of course, unemployment had historic lows, but African Americans have suffered with higher unemployment, and have also been on the front lines in many essential jobs, whether it's in the healthcare field or working in other spaces. And so, again, African Americans are having to put themselves at significant risk, and the cumulative effect of all of those pieces, I think we've seen play out in the streets of America over the past several days. And progress will come, but we have to make sure that from the local level, state level, and federal level, that our politicians, that our leaders are responsive to the calls from protesters for positive change here, because if they're not, then we'll be in this situation again soon.
We'll talk about the COVID-19 impact later on, but I want to quote Atlanta's mayor. He said, well, what happened, she said, what happened in her city is chaos. It's not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. Do you think it is actually turning back against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s principle of peaceful protests? Brendan?
So, yeah, I think the protests today are still in lockstep with Dr. King's nonviolent movement. You do have violence that has erupted, but the protests have largely been peaceful across the country. The protests have largely been focused on positive change, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. And so, no, I don't think these protests are out of step with Dr. King. Dr. King advocated very strongly for civil rights and social justice. He also advocated for economic justice. And so the unfortunate incidents that we've seen with rioting and with looting across the country, those things aren't part of it, but the protest movement, whether it's from organizations like Black Lives Matters or others, is definitely consistent with Dr. King's work.
Professor Hall, I want your opinion on the legal case here. The white officer, Derek Chauvin, was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter for Floyd's death. What does the charges mean? And also, in addition to Derek, the 3 other police officers involved, they were only fired from the force but have not been charged with a crime. What do you think of this?
Well, first of all, I have to say that many years ago, I studied law in Minnesota. So this case happening in Minneapolis makes me feel really, very sad. Under the Minnesota law, the murder of the third stage means that the homicide with the intention of causing bodily harm, but not necessarily death. And usually the criminal convicted of the crimes of this kind of murder would be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 25 years. And judicial practice suggests that usually the sentence is around 12 years and a half. And I find that the 3 other officials, they are only fired. There is no charge, no arrest. This makes me feel a little bit confused because, you know, under the criminal law, murder can be the killing result from negligence or indifference. And the video shows that these 3 officials, they exactly know what was happening, but they do nothing. So from a perspective of law professor, I do believe that they should be arrested and charged with the same crime.
It started with a police brutality caught on video, but it's not just that. CNN journalist, who's an African-American, was arrested on live television for reasons unknown as he covered protests. And at the same time, a white journalist in the same area was not arrested, and police simply asked him to move here and there. So do you think there are systematic racial bias in police law enforcement in the United States? Laura?
I think in some pods of police law enforcement communities, yes. I mean, we saw that on display last week, and we saw a justice system that did not act swiftly enough and is still under question about the charge they issued to the police officer, the fired police officer last week. So, yes, it of course exists, but I can't pretend to know the extent of that problem, not just as a white woman, but as someone that is not in the criminal justice system. But I can certainly say from a point of view that there is obvious systemic racism, and something needs to be done to quell the bias, whether that's education or training or active drills and duty, so that people start calling out their sometimes very unconscious bias. You know, we have a lot of unconscious bias in corporate America, in communities, but I think the more we educate each other on that, we will go forward as a much stronger nation in this century. But we have to acknowledge our mistakes of the past and then fix them in the present in order to be able to go forward in the future. This could be that moment. This could be that turning point, and I hope to God it is.
Brendan, unfortunately, we've been talking about this for many years. It's not the first time this is being brought up. And why America couldn't do anything differently and turn things around and change people's perception about the problem and their practices. Brendan?
Well, this is a problem that is as much a problem of the heart as it is a problem that is systematic. That's a problem with the justice system. That's a problem with law enforcement. That's a problem with government. People have to Laura's point, when they're engaging with other people, recognize that everyone has bias and put in the work that's necessary to address the bias, conscious or unconscious, that you have, and make sure that that bias doesn't impact how you treat other people, especially when you're in a position of power. You know, yesterday was actually the 99-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so African Americans, after being enslaved for so long, after going through the Reconstruction period, after being tormented by the KKK and others, and after having these incredible laws put in place against them to limit voting rights and limit their ability for economic mobility, built this place called Greenwood, Black Wall Street, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there were over 300 black-owned businesses. Anything that you could think of that you would need existed there. It was destroyed by a white mob off of a dubious claim that was made by a white woman about a young black man, and that area was burned to the ground. These issues aren't new, but the greatest thing about Black Wall Street and Greenwood is that it was actually rebuilt bigger and better the second time. What ended up killing it was the fact that there were more opportunities for African Americans in other places, and they built a highway through it. But these issues aren't new. Every time these things happen, Black Americans are able to come back and build something even better, do something even greater, continue to make positive contributions. And so progress is being made. It's certainly not as quick as we want it to be, but what everyone can do is look at themselves and say, what bias do I have, conscious or unconscious, and how can I make sure that the decisions I'm making aren't going to impact someone else negatively, especially when I'm in a position of power. But that's how we get there.
And
there's some policy pieces to it as well, but ultimately it's personal.
We've also collected some social media users' opinions on what happened in Minneapolis. Let's take a look at what some of them have been saying. Jared Sexton said, listen, there are white supremacists looking to start a race war operating within the protests. They are escalating tensions to either cause America to collapse or lead to Trump seizing power. Their end goal is a fascist, a dictatorship. So, Laura, of course, leadership is important in racial issues. Do you think the current American leadership fails somewhere in channeling the racial problem into a constructive way?
I do, and I think we've failed on federal, state, and local levels, as by what we saw within this officer plus his 3 other officers in Minneapolis, and as Brendan pointed out, over even just the last few months in America. And so I do believe that we are all leaders in our own right and have the power to make change on our block in whatever way we can. But I look to the rollback of funding for and programs that were put in place during the Obama administration that were working to a degree, that were taken away during the Trump administration. Leadership comes from the top. I mean, no matter what, we always look to those who lead. What we look to celebrities for what makeup to wear. We look to our politicians to see how we can lead, how we can set an example. But very ironically, what we've seen is leadership by bully, and this is becoming a normal. It's becoming accepted when we see President Trump's horrible behavior towards women, towards Black Americans, towards peers. And I think that is absolutely filtered down to every level. So leadership starts at the top, but if we want to change that, we need to get out and vote. And we have seen numbers change, and we need to make sure we get a bigger participation, and especially in the eyes of this pandemic, do it in a way that's safe and accessible to all. And I do believe that leadership can be changed if we put our minds to it and get out and make our voices and our votes heard.
Do you agree,
That's
Brendan?
really, and right now is the time.
Brendan, do you agree that President Trump and his administration share at least some of the blame for causing this, or at least exacerbating the racial problem in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't think there's any excuse for the Trump administration dismantling that 21st century task force and taking away much of the progress. Now, that task force wasn't perfect, but it was certainly a step in the right direction. The Trump administration was, of course, did get the First Step Act passed, which is a positive thing. However, when it comes to policing, removing that task force and the recommendations that it made definitely wasn't the right thing. But here's what we need in terms of leadership. One, we need our leaders to say the right things. We need our leaders to say that this is obviously a problem and it's something that needs to be addressed. It's amazing that I think so much of the progress over the past decade, almost since Trayvon Martin was killed, has been focused on just getting people to believe, Black Americans, to believe that this is a problem, to believe that this happens consistently. And I think the fact that that's such a basic thing, or at least it would seem to be, hides so much of the progress that has been made, because so much effort has had to be put into just getting people to believe, Black people to believe that this happens. So first, we need leadership to do that. Second, we need leadership to address inequities in the justice system, to make sure that just because you don't have the funding to be able to get things like cash bail, to make sure that just because you don't have the funding to get a good lawyer doesn't mean that you don't have the same rights as other people who may have the economic means to bail themselves out, or the economic means to hire a lawyer from the outside.
Brendan, earlier you mentioned
COVID-19
COVID-19 and its impact disproportionately probably to the African American communities. The death rate of African Americans are higher than the majority whites in America. And that also has economic inequalities, access to health care problems. So these problems are deep-rooted problems in America, and they are also human rights issues. How do you look at all these in a holistic way?
Yeah, well, the repeal and replace movement that really was just a repeal movement for Obamacare, we're seeing the direct impact of those decisions by Republican lawmakers and by Donald Trump. Unfortunately, the economic gains that have been made over the past few years in terms of historically low unemployment for African Americans haven't been matched with the creation of a safety net, in particular, a safety net that's going to protect people from what can be one of the most catastrophic issues, which is health care costs for people. And I think because of lack of health care, you've seen African American and minority communities in the U.S. more generally impacted severely by COVID-19, with in the case of African Americans dying at rates double nationwide what their percentage of what our percentage of the population is. And so these problems existed before the Trump administration was here. Certainly these problems have existed for generations, but removing the 21st Century Task Force, this repeal movement without having a suitable replacement, not ensuring that African American businesses have access to capital so that they can hire and build, all of these things have kind of come to a head during this COVID-19 pandemic and put African Americans in a position that is really unfortunate in terms of the loss of life and in terms of the impact on the community. And again, you're seeing that play out in the streets, this frustration that in every sector there's issues.
And to the wider issue of human rights, because Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, warned that the coronavirus pandemic has become a human rights crisis. As we've been talking with Brendan, the equal access to health care and the equal treatment of all people. It seems this is not something that is supposed to happen in the United States, who claim itself to be the greatest nation on earth, Professor.
Well, as a Chinese, I do find my observation is that it seems that the United States today is a tale of two cities. There are two Americas. One is majority, and the other is minority. And the United States built itself up, leads the world in the protection of human rights. But nowadays, I think that it's quite sad that the U.S. leads the world in the COVID-19 confirmed cases and death tolls. So from the perspective of Chinese, I do believe that what is happening in the United States is quite sad.
So Brendan, do you see what happened in Minneapolis in May this time may serve as a wake-up call so that people can do enough soul searching and do things differently from now on?
I do see it as a wake-up call. I do see it as something that everyone should take notice of, from the corporate side, from the government side, and of course from the personal side. There are things that everyone can be doing, again, on the corporate side, making sure that on corporate boards, in terms of suppliers and supplier diversity, in terms of hiring practices, making sure that African American and Latinx individuals have the opportunity to get those jobs and build wealth. On the government side, fixing things like the cash bail system that seems to reward people that have economic means but punish people who do not have economic means when they encounter the justice system. And then on the personal side, everyone has bias, so ensuring that you are recognizing that you have bias, conscious or unconscious, and that you're taking steps to ensure that whatever bias you have isn't impacting other people in a negative way, especially if you find yourself in a position of power.
Laura, do you share the same optimism? The wound will be healed?
I believe that this is an opportunity, but in order to act on this opportunity, we need to educate and empower the public with information on their elected officials and the way in which they are voting, in what they are proposing and what they are against, so that we can, in an educated fashion, go to the ballot box this November. It's very interesting with the timing of this terrible tragedy. We do have the chance within 6 months to make that change, but we have to see it as an opportunity and then take action to ensure that we rally together and we drown out the riots and the disgusting acts in the evenings. This is our chance. This is our opportunity, and we need to empower those around us to rally together and take it as one.
All right. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Brendan. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.